welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Josh Shepperd, Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the Catholic University of America, Sound Fellow at the Library of Congress National Recording Preservation Board, and Humanities and Information Fellow at Penn State. We will discuss his work on the history of radio and the preservation of sound recordings. So welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to this. I'm super excited about the work that you're doing and have been following it really avidly. But for listeners who might not be as invested already in the preservation of sound recordings as I am, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are the National Recording Preservation Board and the Radio Preservation Task Force? Like, why were they formed and what exactly do they do?
Yeah, so the National Recording Preservation Board is an extension of the Library of Congress Packard Center, which is in Culpeper, Virginia. And its role is basically to do communications work and outreach work on behalf of the Library of Congress to address different contradictions and problems and policy issues and academic work around the generalized recording status of U.S. broadcasting and audio recording. So essentially what the Recording Preservation Board is it's a way for the Library of Congress to bring in scholars, different organizations from the Grammy Awards to academic organizations to the Country Music Awards and other groups to put heads together about problems the recording field is facing.
Cool. And so what about the Radio Preservation Task Force? Like, as operationalizing these projects, what exactly is it and what is it doing?
So the task force is a mirror to a few projects that we see in our sister group, the National Film Preservation Board, which is still run by the same people. That's Steve Leggett and Kerry Odell at the Library of Congress out of the Packard Center. And the task force is based upon a study that was done probably about 6 or 7 years ago called the National Recording Preservation Plan that identified different problems with degrading and decaying materials related to broadcasting, as well as standards for digitization, best practices for preservation of endangered materials, of new materials, recommendations for access and curation. And the task force came out of the plan when they realized that they didn't know where specific radio materials were even held. So essentially what you have in a lot of cases with audio materials that are music related is you have the warehouses, you have different archives, you have different music groups, and they've cataloged and done at least in the minimum what they call collection level descriptions of what exists. And then from there, you can begin to search where the materials are. And that's important for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons, of course, is that estates and ownership about the materials can be checked across to where they're held, and then trace that back to who was on the recording and where it was copyrighted, and then who put the record out or whatever. So in the case of radio, they realized that no such centralized system or even regionalized system existed, and they wanted to figure out where the materials were stored in the United States, and they formed a task force to begin to aggregate collection level description information. So essentially just collection level is the difference between what is in the general contours of an archive, and then item level descriptions would be like the individual recordings. So they mandated us to do a collection level description search. And what happened was we realized pretty quickly that this had not only never been traced, but the materials were highly endangered. So the task force began by searching, and within the first year or so, we had accumulated about 100 professors working on the project. And then we kept hearing the same story, which is that, okay, the materials were here 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but they were on reel-to-reels, or they were on these old giant 16-inch records, which they call program transcriptions, and we trashed them. Or the radio station was sold, under consolidation, and then the commercial station didn't want to keep the records, so they looked for maybe somewhere like an archive to take them. The archives wouldn't take them, so they trashed them, they incinerated them. So what essentially the task force is and became is it's a search for the recordings, and it's also kind of an unwieldy large academic project now, by which we're trying to figure out strategies to preserve the materials, study the materials, and turn them into research. And it's become a digital humanities project insofar as that we underwrite a lot of grant work now too. So a lot of my time is helping different institutions write grants and writing letters for those grants so that we can preserve what we have found.
So, I mean, to the extent the materials have been preserved and to the extent that you sort of can really speak to this at this point, like how much of what was originally created still exists? Like sort of what kind of state is it in and what needs to be done in order to preserve that kind of material?
Yeah, so there's a couple of little stories here that answer that question. So the first is that it seems like a lot of materials were available before the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So essentially, once that bill was passed and allowed greater consolidation of areas, a bigger corporate ownership moved in and began to take control over different sites, and the sites in which radio was produced, in which the records were stored. And over time, this wasn't a very profitable, or at least the royalty structure had not been figured out by the different commercial groups that had bought the stations. But it wasn't very profitable to preserve all those old reel-to-reels because of the processes that it takes to actually do the preservation. So I think we lost probably, it's all anecdotal, but we lost at least half of what even existed up to 1996, between 96 and 2006 or so. A lot of it was just thrown out based upon the consolidation movement in regional radio. So essentially what's left is what a lot of public media, a lot of community media, a lot of commercial media that's locked away, and then to some extent like news broadcasts. If I had to really speculate where we were maybe in like 1990 or like 1985 with radio recordings before the digital kind of took over everything, to where we are now, I would say we've probably lost somewhere between 75% and 99% of United States' radio history. And a lot of it was because of the Telecommunications Act, and I think that's pretty crucial because the ownership or the contours of ownership affect how historical memory gets stored and then recognized, besides that it changed the different ownership rules. So essentially what's left faces the same kinds of problems with degradation that early film does, which is to say some of the recordings are pretty stable. So if it's a record and it's which they call program transcription, so if it's a transcription, those actually are in pretty good shape if it's being held in a dry and a decently warm room, and et cetera. But there's certain kinds of tape that were used, especially in the 80s and 70s, that have a certain caustic glues or have this like tendency to sort of stiffen up on itself, which they call sticky shed syndrome. And these recordings are highly endangered. And so essentially what we're looking at here is not only have we lost a huge amount of this history already, but we're also on the verge within the next 10 years or so, according to the great experts, at the Smithsonian and Library of Congress and other places, of losing a lot of the rest of it. So what we have here is a task force that's trying to figure out how we might incentivize preservation of U.S. history. And we have some historiographical models that we've been working with to try to do that incentivization.
Right. Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like a crisis moment. If institutions or individuals are in possession of this kind of material, what can and should they do with it? Are there places where they can deposit it or ways they can provide information about collections that would be helpful?
Yes. So we, on the first question, is there something we could do with it? This is the great problem. And one of the historiographical problems that we face is that there's a lot of historians and there's a lot of archives that have not treated sound materials as viable sources of equal quality to paper. And if we come up with a collection, so the one anecdote, and this made, I think, like national or international news like 3 or 4 years ago. There was a warehouse in Detroit full of radio materials, and it was a radio station that had chronicled the rise of Motown. And so it had all of these like live radio broadcasts with live performances of Motown artists in Detroit in the 60s, and they were going to tear down the entire building and then just trash whatever was in it with the tear down of the building. And one of our members of our task force wrote a piece on it, Derek Valiant at University of Michigan. It got a little bit of press coverage. The academic community was aware of it, and we could not find one archive in the United States to take those recordings. And so the question is why? And there's a few very legitimate reasons. So the first reason is that when you create an accession at a library, so when there's a donation or a deposit of materials, what this does is it actually reorganizes the time of the archivists and librarians. So it's not just that you gave materials to a library, but that someone's job is literally changed upon the reception of those materials. And then the next problem is that different reel-to-reels, for example, are an obsolete media. And so they have to have the right equipment to even listen to the materials, let alone find strategies to turn them into digital files or something like that. So we have an equipment problem. And then beyond that, even, the notion that radio itself is kind of like low culture material has really prevented a lot of universities from taking seriously that radio is a big part of our cultural heritage. And so we have these like multi-front difficulties getting materials placed, and we've literally been trying to figure this out for 5 years. And all we keep doing is writing sort of recommendations and reports on it. But it hasn't really persuaded too many people yet. However, the last 2 or 3 years, we've actually had a really great track record of getting grant money sent through radio collection. So if a university has activated itself to take seriously sound history, then they tend to be pretty successful finding grants within 1 to 3 years. So it takes usually 1 or 2 times a reapplication until one of the granting agencies takes it totally seriously. But most of the things that I've signed off on have eventually gotten grants, which is the good news because of the good work of the libraries who have taken this seriously.
What can people who are in possession of this material, whether it's an institution or an individual, what can they do with it to sort of facilitate its preservation and find it a home?
So, okay, right. So, yeah, the answer is we actually don't know yet. That's the unfortunate answer after 5 years of thousands of hours of work. Is one, we have a lot of ideas, like there should be a central repository that receives these information, these different tapes, and then digitizes the information. The Library of Congress is kind of out of space. And then there's an additional factor, which is that let's say something is historically important and gets donated. It has to then be listened to. And if someone has the equipment, it's not always clear what's on the tapes. Sometimes like a big reel-to-reel just has like a date on it. And so if it only has a date on it, it has to be processed. They have to create metadata for the actual object that they're listening to. And this requires time, but it also requires the equipment, and it requires the attention and the interest and all that kind of stuff. So part of getting something donated means that it can be processed a lot of the time. And we have problems with that because of the equipment deficiencies. So what I would say is hold on to the materials while we're working on the issue, because there are a lot of people. So we have like 200 plus professors on the project now, about 50 archivists. And the world moves very slowly in this kind of work. And every year we make a push to try to get something really resolute done. And every year we push for a foot, we get an inch, So it is something that if you have these old radio materials, it's crucial that you hold on to them until we can kind of figure out the logistics and the economy of scale by which things can be preserved. Because even the preservation itself, if we get to that point, is extremely expensive. It's like $100 per recording minimum, depending on the quality of the recording in terms of how well preserved it is.
So first, don't throw it out. And second, is there anything that institutions or individuals can do to sort of maximize the lifespan and minimize the likelihood of degradation of materials?
Yeah. So, don't leave it in humidity. Keep it somewhere as dry as possible, with as stable as temperature as possible, not too warm, not too cold. Cold's a little better than warm. talk to your local university if you think you got something that's important. And I'd love to talk a little bit about the historiography of how we think about why it's important too.
Mm,
And I would say that, and if it's really important to you and you think it's really important for like your local, regional, or national culture, we try to find ways to band together projects and then apply for grants with things that are banded together. And so you can only get so much money out of a grant. So it usually is only then a selection of what is even on hand that gets preserved. But I look for partnerships. So I would, if I was a radio station listening to this, or an archivist, I would definitely contact your local university, especially if the radio materials have local history on it, which is part of the historiographical argument we're developing.
Well, so about the historiography, I mean, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on why it's important specifically to preserve radio history. I mean, what can radio history tell us about America and American culture that other archival sources maybe don't?
Yeah. So radio history is it's an interesting history because I think people envision Jack Benny, and stuff like that, which is great. Variety shows, entertainment, The Shadow, or on the bad side, Amos and Andy. And these are important historical markers of fiction and theatrical performance. But most of radio history is actually non-theatrical. So essentially, it's call-in shows. It's like community organizing broadcasts. It's public affairs programming. And essentially what you have on radio recordings, we have found, and we kind of always knew this, but we didn't realize just how emphasized it was till we started the project. Essentially what you have on a radio recording is a sound trail of especially local history in these interviews and call-in shows that's political and cultural and picks up where paper trails leave off. So essentially what you have is different histories of different experiences that you can't always find in paper trails. So civil rights broadcasts, different activisms. And one of the beauties of, like, for instance, community radio for historians and for activists is that there's no middleman. There's no one interpreting or editing or censoring what someone is saying on the air. Someone is from 1972 in the feminist movement at Pacifica. They have this giant feminist history of recordings. Just gets on the air and is doing community organizing work by radio. And that, for us, is an extremely valuable repository. So orientation history, race and rights history, gender history, a lot of the things the Academy really values in research and did not as much as it should for a long time and is now really emphasizing as it should. Radio turns out to be one of the great primary source repositories, period. And in fact, is definitely the most unexplored political and cultural history repository in the US. So even with all of the losses we have in radio, there's probably still something like 500,000 to 800,000 hours of history that could be preserved immediately and go into use for research and for just public consumption.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, like, I've come across occasional LPs of radio broadcasts from the 50s, 60s, 70s on some of these subjects and been really surprised by the sort of alternative perspectives and the way those perspectives were being expressed. And it really does seem like there's this kind of like deep kind of ulterior sort of perspective, like alternative perspective to American culture that's preserved in the radio in a way that it really wasn't preserved in other media, especially when it comes to like community radio and activist radio and all these kind of media.
Yeah, we try to work closely with different groups like Pacifica, or we work with NPR, or we'll work, with different archives that have these types of histories. And you begin to realize that, okay, let's get our friends who are professors who work in these areas, let's help them curate which materials might be preserved and go immediately into research. And it's just like a wealth of political and cultural history that we keep saying that we want, but but have to take steps to actually make available. So there's a political economy essentially that I think law listeners will appreciate to this process, because it's not just, okay, we found a recording, now it's available. It has to go through all kinds of different logistical maneuvers and answer to a state law, and then be made publicly available or not. And then that depends on a lot of factors. And it really is centered on alterity history, especially with the non-theatrical recordings, in ways that are also accounted for in paper, but not necessarily as holistically as we sometimes wish that it was. So I'm just making a case here that we should be taking very seriously that sound history is cultural history.
Well, so I'm a copyright professor, so I would be remiss if I didn't at least ask you one copyright question. And so I got to know, like, sort of, copyright so frequently creates difficulties, transactions, costs in so many contexts. To what extent does copyright law make the preservation and provision of access to this material more difficult?
Yeah. So there's a lot of answers to this. The first answer is that for something to be made publicly available, they have to have either estate permissions or some kind of like clever cocktail by which litigation is reduced to a minimum in the making available. So I point to a couple projects. So like the American Archives of Public Broadcasting out of the WGBH and the Library of Congress, some of like archive.org, they've begun to take on the difficult gray territory by which making available potentially is not just something, if it's nonprofit, that siphons away profits, but that might account for profits lost, which is still grounds for litigation, which gets a lot of cease and desist possible letters. So essentially, if there's a recording and there's 8 voices on that recording, hypothetically, all 8 voices have to give permission to make it publicly available. Now, in the case of certain recordings, public media, often there is a waiver that's signed that it can be made for public consumption. In the case of certain commercial media, they might have signed over rights depending on the broadcast, by which it is then under the domain of the broadcaster that broadcasted it in the first place. And then in the case of community media, it's sometimes there's nothing at all happening except for the voices on the radio. Nothing happened legally at all. So it doesn't mean that it would lead to lawsuits, but it does mean that there is this like question over who owns it, and if it's made available, did someone lose something in that process, and should they be made whole? So the Music Modernization Act has made one definite important provision, which is that it allows for this 90-day reporting that you can file, by which it's going to be used for nonprofit purposes, which would reduce the probability of any type of litigation for orphan works. And so in the case of orphan works, we have this huge problem by which it's not always clear who's on the recording, who owns the recording, what we should do with it. It often is like one-off recording of a different political history or like an interview or something like that. And we're not always sure how to approach it. And what essentially has happened is historically they just haven't been preserved. So it's like, okay, we don't know what to do with this orphan work. So an orphan work being just simply that we can't track down, the legal estates by which to contact. So essentially the orphan works have sat there in a lot of cases for a lot of years and just decaying. And now it seems to be moving a little bit more towards that we should be able to at least preserve materials and make them available within, fair use and just put them down for safe harbor.
Well, so shifting gears a little bit, Josh, I understand that you're working on a larger project about the history of public broadcasting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that project, sort of how it came to happen and what your goals for it are.
Yeah, well, my day job is that I'm a media historian, besides working on this project. And yeah, at some point we realized amongst media historians that no one had written a history of public broadcasting in the United States, if you can believe it. So, and I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that it is a history that began at universities. and that it was spread out across multiple different locations that then coalesced into a national institution over about 40 years. So it required me going to 36 collections over about 7 years or so, and obtaining grants for that to be able to dig into that research. And also, we have a very commercial focused culture here. So essentially the default public sphere in American culture is for profit, and logics of accumulation culture. And I feel like film and media studies, which has chronicled so many minutiae of film, for example, it never occurred to film and media studies that we should do a granular analysis of our non-commercial system as well. So I began with those sort of assumptions and those problems at hand. And what I discovered was that there's a very famous book by Robert McChesney at the University of Illinois, and he points to how commercial broadcasting became the standardized model through the Communications Act of 1934. And his book is an important book, and it essentially traces the 1920s till 34, and then it kind of ends. And it ends on this note that this was like this great paradise lost of possible non-commercial media history, by which we might have had a BBC or something like that. And that became the dominant narrative to film and media studies, is that we had this private system and that it could have been different. But what I found in the archives with respect to his book was within 1 year of the Communications Act, by 1935, the same people who he discusses in his book went about building non-commercial media infrastructures. So essentially, before 34, there's this strong activism to set aside frequencies for non-competitive use. And what happens is, once the Communications Act defines the American system, which was loosely in terms of what they called public interest instead of public service, a lot of the stations that were nonprofit could not compete with the criteria for public interest, which meant like maintenance of facilities, a 12-hour broadcast day in a lot of cases, paying the labor. And a lot of them literally disappeared within 6 months after 34, and that's where the famous book ends. But by 35, the activism begins to transform into like more of what I call an advocacy, which is that based upon the rules of facilities maintenance that you find in the Communications Act, universities who are more interested in creating equal access to education through media begin to try to build educational infrastructure by which different curriculum could be accessed through radio, regardless of where one's station was economically and regardless of where one lived. So if one was in a rural or agrarian community in the Midwest in the 1940s, it was still pretty hard to access the same level of education that you can now, and there's still discrepancies, of course. And so the ambition there was to rectify that through the creation of genres that we now have on public media. Home economics became cooking shows. You get travel shows. You learn about languages through travel shows in the earlier days on the radio. You have Head Start programming like Sesame Street and early days of children's programming, and learning how to count by radio and all that kind of stuff. So what happens is that after about 35 to 67, which is the Public Broadcasting Act, all of these different institutions start to get involved in the advocacy. You get philanthropic groups like the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundations, which is why public media in the U.S. is always still philanthropically funded. That was the precedent. You get the Office of Education and actually the FCC itself, which did not necessarily want to take away those licenses in 35, working with a kind of a grassroots broadcasting movement to create an infrastructure by which access to educational programming was widely available. And by 1950 or so, they created what they called the Bicycle Network, which was the prototype for PBS and NPR. It was essentially the best program produced by a university station would be bicycled around the country to different stations so that everyone had equally good programming. And it became what they called back then like a fourth network. So the three networks were ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then the fourth network was the educational university broadcasts that began to emerge around that time.
Well, so you sent me a draft chapter from your book, which I thought was fantastic. And it told like a really fascinating story about essentially the FCC and the Department of Education bringing like Frankfurt School theorist Theodor Adorno to come advise them about what American radio should look like. I mean, I wonder, could you like just touch on that for a moment, because I love the story and I thought it was really telling and just a fascinating moment in American history that seems to say a lot about that period.
Yeah, it was a total accident that I discovered these personal letters between Theodor Adorno and Paul Lazarsfeld, who's often crediting with being the founder of communication studies and different models of quantitative sociology, um, and advertising research in the US. So essentially, after the Communications Act and the decimation of educational stations, two things happened. The first is that commercial stations were tasked with taking up the slack for educational stations by the FCC. And they called that sustaining broadcasting instead of public service broadcasting. And the commercial stations did not find that profitable and didn't want to do it. They just wanted certain frequencies for themselves that were easiest to access. So they were actually interested in an alternative being formed that didn't necessarily compete with them, but could be supported. The other thing that happened was a lot of those who were invested in broadcasting per se realized that they weren't sure how effective educational broadcasts actually were in the classroom. They didn't have evidence that said that this is effective for these reasons. So there's a pursuant that's written by the FCC to the Communications Act that then kind of mandates a path by which educational stations could reclaim some frequencies. And one of the stipulations of the pursuant is that there has to be a better understanding of the aesthetics of radio for educators. Like, it has to actually reach the audiences and have an impact on the audiences. So the FCC, the Office of Education, the Rockefeller Foundation, and then a bunch of educational interests and the commercial broadcasters formed something called the Federal Radio Education Committee, or FREC. And FREC was fascinating because it was something that broke down the public-private binary that we usually assume with American media history. There's a lot of this sort of public versus private, private versus public, but they were working pretty closely together on answering questions about best practices. And one of the questions of best practices turned out to be developing a technique or methodology to understand audiences. And this is the first audience research we ever see in media history that is as dynamic as it is. And I'll try to say a couple words about that. So essentially, a guy named Harvey Cantrell at Princeton hired Paul Lazarsfeld, his wife Herta Herzog, who deserves a lot more attention because she helped to invent advertising research for the world, basically the methodologies, beginning with this project, and a guy named Frank Stanton. And Frank Stanton was a researcher at CBS who was allocated by CBS for this project for a period of time. He goes on to become president of CBS. He was a very famous broadcasting figure, but he's very young in this scenario. And what they do is they begin to refine demographic research. So there were certain models of media effects and demographic research going back to the late teens into the 20s. But a lot of times those models asked questions like, so they give you a bunch of categories and say, okay, which category are you in? But it was not a comprehensive set of categories for affiliation. And so what the Princeton Radio Research Project did, underwritten by these different groups, was it said, well, hold on a minute, which category would you yourself say you're in? And then what happened was the categories just sort of exploded. There was all of these dynamic categories that could be ascribed to a listener at any given time. And what that did was that it made it possible for one listener in New Jersey, for example, to actually match up to a listener in North Dakota. And if they were presented with the same content, they would elicit similar responses based upon the deep refinement of demographic affiliation that was self-identified. So this was like the major breakthrough in like modern sociological research, which is to say we need more categories and we can get it so granular that we can begin to see patterns, as Weber says, like in the cosmos of human engagement, by which you have networks that are not simply localized. The networks are actually affiliative. So what happens is At the same time, Lazarsfeld, who was a very brilliant guy, begins to realize that the kind of research they're doing, which they called administrative research, was not comprehensive enough to account for anything beyond the question asked about the content. So they figured out demography, but they couldn't figure out the use of the results beyond the moment in which it was posited. So they for some reason they went to the Frankfurt School. There's actually a few reasons, but I'll skip those reasons. And they said, we need someone to help us with policy language to explain this breakthrough to FREC and the FCC, and we also need someone to help us understand like the social implications of this new type of quantitative research. They're essentially taking something quite holistic, which is being itself, and turning it into fragments and categories. And so they wanted someone to help them think through the social context of quantitative research. And that's why Adorno came to America. And so no one has ever written about this, and I discovered it on accident. But everyone knows he came to America. They say it's because he was a genius, which is probably true. But it was actually to work on public broadcasting. And it was, and so you have this great civic history where Adorno comes to America to work on this great civic project of quantitative research. And so the famous story goes, the apocryphal story, which is actually triangulated by findings in the archives, that immediately he clashed with the people because they were doing math about people, and he thought we needed something much more phenomenological, something that was a little bit more Marxian. So essentially what he thought we needed was something that never fragmented humans from their experience and from the holistic reception, not only of content, but its place within a broader social embeddedness. And it just like blew their minds. Like they were like, what is this guy talking about? We figured out some math, and it's helping us understand how people are responding to content, and most importantly, this is going to give us like better frequencies for educational broadcasting so we can have better access to education in this country. And Adorno's like, no, you're ruining democracy because it's fragmenting everyone from their actual embodiment, and so they fire him. They fire him like a year later. So he barely makes it like a year, but it gets him to America, which was very important in the build-up to World War II, as we know, because he was Jewish. And but what's interesting about the story is that for a moment, like communication studies, and Adorno doesn't really get famous in America until the 60s, with the culture industries articles and these types of things, which were brewing as early as the 30s. But for a moment, communication studies almost had critical theory as one of its primary methodologies, because communication studies as departments doesn't even emerge until 47, 48 in the country. So it's one of the last academic departments in the humanities and social sciences now that forms. A lot of the other ones are very ancient. And but instead what happened was they ended up going the route of political economy, which was more empirical in nature. The empirical structure of political economic research matched the empirical structure of broadcasting production and quantitative, demography of audiences. So that's the Adorno discovery, was that I think no one actually really quite understood where Adorno came from, like why. And then you realize that like public broadcasting history fomented these great intellectual traditions. So you have like public broadcasting history. It's not something we've studied enough. And it turns out to be the reason we have communication studies in the US and the reason Adorno comes to America. Later in the process, we don't have to talk about this, but it's also the reason that Marshall McLuhan did a lot of his work in the late 50s and then became famous in the 60s. So the concept, my closing concept about this is that the concept of social ameliorative work, the concept that there should be a nonprofit use of media to improve democracy, is a great engendering and fomenting part of American cultural history. And the more and more we think we have to profit off of things, the more it does fragment us from these holistic democratic questions. And I think that both the quantitative and qualitative researchers were right about that. So once we're attuned to how do we improve democracy through media, all of these great ideas come out of it. And that's one of the takeaways for this kind of research.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited about the book, and I can't wait to read it. And we'll have to do another interview when it comes out. I was wondering, Josh, if in closing, you could maybe offer some thoughts for scholars who aren't necessarily already embedded in sound recording history as to how they can use sort of archival radio in their own research and also use it pedagogically for their students.
Yeah. So one of the problems, of course, with sound recordings is that we are very writing based, including me. So there's these new technologies that are beginning to transition sound recordings into paper trails. So the preservation of sound is actually becoming a paper archive as well. What I would say is sometimes you just got to sit down and listen for a few hours and take notes, just like a lecture. And this type of work is much slower, sound, historical work. And it is also something in which you listen to the timbre of the voice. You listen to the pauses in how people talk. You listen to the dynamic between people, which are things you can't pick up always from writing, although you can sometimes. And sound research does have these dimensions that are quite affective. They're not just informational, but it does take some interpretation about human dynamics and human histories that come across. You listen to people's dialects. And so if one is studying something like activism, you can go to the Library of Congress, you can go to a lot of great universities doing this preservation work. The University of Minnesota just got a great preservation grant. Indiana University, University of California, Santa Barbara, Hagley, which is at Syracuse. I'm sorry, Hagley is at the University of Delaware, and then Belfer Archive at Syracuse University. There's these great repositories of sound history, and you set some time aside, and you just have to move a little slower than paper trails. But the payoff, I think, has more ethnographic dimensions than some parts of writing history. And so it's definitely worth doing. It's not a replacement, it's a complement.
Well, I hope we've made a little contribution to sound history today, and I really appreciate you coming on the program, Josh. It's been a lot of fun talking to you about your incredible work.
Thank you for having me.
The driver said that if I refused to leave the seat, he would have to call the police, and I told him just call the police, which he did, and when they came, they placed me under arrest.
Wasn't that a pretty frightening thing to be arrested in Montgomery, Alabama?
No, I wasn't frightened at all.
You weren't frightened? Why
No.
weren't you frightened?
I don't know why I wasn't, but I didn't feel afraid. I had decided that I would have to know once and for all what rights I had as a human being and a citizen, even in Montgomery, Alabama.